Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance discussion. Thanks so much for joining on Zoom today and for your partnership in the Research America Alliance. If your organization is not a member, we invite you to stay as our guest today, but please get in touch with my colleague Joel. He's happy to connect you to discuss the value that comes with being an Alliance member organization. His email will be in the chat. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Yvette Seger, Director of Science Policy at the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. Yvette will be giving us a crash course on how you can weigh in on policy at NIH and other research agencies through requests for information or RFIs. As always, please type your questions in the Q&A box or chat, and we'll pose as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of today's session. So thank you so much for joining us. Yvette, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Savannah. And thank you all at Research America for having me today, talking about one of my very favorite things that I do at FASEB, and that is providing stakeholder feedback on important issues to the research community. So I went with the title, Weighing In on Policy Development. It's easier than you think. All right, so my goals for this session, and we'll see at the end if I've achieved them, but I want to help enhance awareness of opportunities for stakeholders, that's all of you, to provide input on the regulatory and policymaking process. Point two is that I want to share some of the best practices for developing and submitting feedback to requests for public comment, so that your comments attract attention, that your comments are meaningful to the agency to whom you are commenting. And third, I want to just highlight a couple of opportunities seeking stakeholder feedback, which I think was part of the impetus for today's discussion. I would be remiss if I did not take the opportunity to talk a little bit about my organization, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, or FASEB. If you are not familiar with FASEB, we are a coalition of 27 scientific societies representing over 115,000 individual sciences across the biological and biomedical research fields, and you can see the breadth of the science we represent here just in the logos of our member organizations. So we'll get into the meat of today's topic, and it's always good to make sure that we are using the same words. Words are very important in policy. They're also very important in science. Up here, I list a few key definitions. I think we're all familiar with a law. This is the role of Congress and the president. Congress will develop the laws. The president can sign them into law. The second piece is regulations. These are the standards and rules adopted by administrative agencies that govern how laws will be enforced. So the law happens, and then you have the regulations to figure out how to enforce them. So regulations obviously have the force of law. Then you have policies, which are implemented by agencies to establish uniform processes and reporting expectations. They're not law, but if you don't follow policies or if you're non-compliant, you can have some negative consequences. And then the last definition that I have here is guidance documents, and these are issued by agencies to assist in the interpretations of regulations. For the purpose of today's discussion, we're just focusing on those middle two, regulations and policies, which, much to my annoyance, get used interchangeably. So for those of you who are scientists thinking about moving into policy, or just science enthusiasts, you might see some familiarity in a process that we're all very well entrenched in, and that's the scientific method. So that's a common thing that I hear of people wanting to jump from a research field into engaging in public policy. It's like, I'm trained as a scientist, I don't know anything about this. It's actually not that different, because it's all rooted in the scientific method. So we all know the scientific method. You have a topic area, you have a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis with experiments, you analyze the data, you report the conclusions, and you keep going around in circles, literally. But the same thing can be said about the policymaking process. We love wheels here in Washington. So, some of the language might be different from the scientific method on the left, but the strategy is same for the policy making on the right. So you define a problem. What's the issue we're trying to address? And then you have a hypothesis, you test it, you analyze the issue. And then instead of having a lot of data at the end to analyze, you will make recommendations for policymakers to resolve that issue that you had at the beginning of the wheel. And then you implement those recommendations, test them, see how they work. Then you evaluate them, and then you assess how that process works. So really, it's not that different from doing experiments in the lab. You are just doing experiments mainly on paper, and how you are implementing programs. So thinking about this policy development wheel, when is stakeholder input collected? And the simplest answer is all stages. But for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm going to focus on three. And that is defining the problem, developing and analyzing alternatives, and the evaluation process. And for the work that I do with FASEB, these are the three key areas where we typically weigh in as an organization. So how is this input collected? The spoiler alert, today's session was focusing on looking at responses to requests for information or calls for comments. Since we like alphabet soup here in DC, sometimes you will hear this referred to by its acronym, RFI, request for information. But if you are looking at a regulatory process, the acronym is ANPRM or NPRM. I did not define these on this slide, but ANPRM is an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and NPRM is a notice of proposed rulemaking. The regulatory process can be so extensive that sometimes they do an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to give you a heads up that an agency is thinking about making a regulatory change so that the community is not taken off guard. But in more direct regulatory changes, they will typically start with a notice of proposed rulemaking. Bottom line is it's the same process. They are seeking your input on proposed changes. So that's the bread and butter. That is something that RFIs and NPRMs is what keeps my team very busy. There are also other opportunities for engaging stakeholders, and that can be testimony or public comments, like actually going in front of a committee or an advisory panel and providing your feedback, doing expert interviews, doing your own data analysis, and also literature searches. Again, not that far from what a scientist would be doing to do a deep dive into a research question. So where do I find these common opportunities? And I'm going to walk through some of my favorites. So the first slide is what I would call traditional modes of communicating with stakeholders. The first one is my tried and true favorite, the Federal Register. This is basically the newspaper of the US government. If you want to know anything about meetings going on at federal agencies, as well as requests for information, the Federal Register is the first stop. So this is usually one of the first things that I will read in the morning just to see if there is anything of interest to the FASEB community. Second one is if you are more interested in regulatory processes, is the very easy one to remember, regulations.gov. And this is where you can search for your topic in the search bar, or you might have a specific, they call it a docket, that you can search for. And this is basically an electronic file drawer for everything that an agency is collecting on a specific issue. And then for NIH focus, the NIH guide not only tells investigators about new funding opportunities, but this is also where NIH will share opportunities for comments, including or this request for information that I've shown here. So those are the three traditional modes. However, these were actually in hard copy at some point. Now they're digital, but now we can also look for different opportunities. I would call them new tech opportunities to comment. We're seeing a lot more of engagement through agency blogs. This is a typical mode of the White House Office of Science and Technology policy, or anything coming out of the White House. They know that people will read blogs, they will go to the newsroom, and so a lot of times you will see these comment opportunities posted in a blog format, and they may never hit the Federal Register. Also, the specific agency blogs or institutes within the NIH, most of the institutes have their own blogs. One of my favorites to follow is the Center for Scientific Review. This is where the agency can let you know what they're thinking about, what they might be working on with their Federal Advisory Committee. This is one from last year where the Center for Scientific Review at NIH was looking at what changes need to be made when reviewing fellowship applications versus research applications. You can also go to specific Federal Advisory Committee websites. So this is also coming from our friends at NIH. The Advisory Committee to the Director is the main advisory body supporting the NIH Director and providing advice. They have a very good website for the ACD where they catalog all the presentations and meeting materials. And there is a working group that you've probably heard about, the ACD Working Group on Re-envisioning NIH-supported postdoctoral training, that this is where they posted their request for information. Spoiler alert, this link in this website goes out to the NIH guide, but this is a lot easier to find, particularly if you are not an avid reader of the NIH guide. And then there's Old Faithful, Twitter. So a lot of the agencies are not only using the traditional modes of communicating their opportunities for comments, but they want to make sure that they're seen by the targeted audience. So going on Twitter, sometimes you'll also see it posted on LinkedIn. They're recognizing that researchers are getting their information from different places, and so testing out different modes of making these opportunities available to the appropriate stakeholders. All right, so you have read the Federal Register, you saw a comment opportunity on Twitter, you're interested in commenting. Now what? How do I go about developing and submitting comments? First question is, it seems very simple, but you really have to ask this. Who are you representing? So I am sitting here today not representing myself. I am actually representing my organization, FASEB. And so depending on who I am representing, that will change a lot of the parameters for how you develop your comments. What I would develop for Yvette Seger, PhD, would be completely different. Well, it was slightly related to what I would develop for FASEB. So you really have to ask, am I submitting these comments on behalf of myself? Am I submitting them on behalf of my employer? Or am I submitting them on behalf of another organization? Keep that in mind as we go through some of the other steps. So I will take the angle, since I represent an organization, to think about, is there an existing process for developing comments? If you're representing yourself, your process is likely going to be, I'm going to sit and brainstorm and write a draft, and I'm going to edit, maybe I'll share it with someone else. But when you're representing an organization or your employer, you need to start thinking about the process for developing comments. Who needs to be engaged in the development and review of comments? At FASEB, we have a really extensive governance process. So there is usually an engagement of a subcommittee of our Science Policy Committee, as well as our Science Policy Committee, and then the comments are finalized by our Board of Directors. That gets to the second point. Do the comments require governance votes or approval? So, I can't sit at my desk and write a beautiful set of comments and submit it without going through process. Chances are I can draft a good set of comments that will get through our governance process, but since we are representing 27 societies and 115,000 individual scientists, there needs to be that check that I am representing all of our voices. So, think about, do I have to get this approved in some way? And then the third point is, who is the signatory or the submitter of the comments? Newsflash, I may be submitting a lot of the comments on behalf of FASEB, but the signature on the letter is not mine. It is FASEB's president. Only the president can speak on behalf of FASEB. So you need to understand, what are these key points? Do I have to get approval? Who is going to be the person who transmits it, to make sure that your comments are respected by your organization and also respected by the recipient organization. So what makes a good response? First and foremost, clearly states who you are or the constituents you represent. So right off the bat, any comments that we develop at FASEB start off with, these comments are submitted on behalf of the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, a coalition of 27 scientific societies representing blah, blah, blah. You've heard it all before. Getting that out straight out of the gate lets the reader know, okay, this is an organizational comment. It gives you an idea of the weight. If you were submitting comments on behalf of yourself, you could say, I'm a postdoctoral scholar at XYZ institution. I study this. It gives you that credibility. The reader knows who you are. The second point is that your comments should be personalized, even if you're building on uniform content. So FASEB has been around for over 100 years, and we have a lot of statements. And so we will cross-check prior statements as appropriate. Even if it's uniform content, we want to make sure that we are personalizing our comments to the recipient. Are we fully responding to the questions posed in the request for information? The third, and there are sub-bullets here, when you get to the meat of your comments, you are wanting to highlight what you like about the proposed changes. I usually like to also acknowledge the amount of work and deliberation depending on the topic. But you also want to identify any unintended consequences of the proposed changes. And I just want to caveat this, that this isn't always bad. You could have unintended consequences to lead to positive change, but you are, as a commenter, you are highlighting things that the agency may not be able to see because they are not sitting, or they don't have your same perspective. And in that same vein, you want to suggest solutions rather than just reiterating the problem. The least effective comments are those that basically say that this proposed policy sucks. Sincerely, blah, blah, blah. You want to give a reason why you don't like this policy. You want to provide solutions. How could this be improved to better meet the needs of the stakeholders you represent? And also along those lines, provide data and references to justify your rationale. This is critically important. It might be information that the agency doesn't have access to, and you are providing a great window for them to have additional data that they might not have had access to. And you always want to offer to make additional information available as requested. Sometimes, and we'll talk about this with some of the examples, there are limitations to the information that you can provide in a letter, or you might be limited to a form. And just by extending the, hey, we're here to help if you need more information, there's plenty more where these data came from, we're here to help, is always a good tone to set in your comments. So other tips and tricks that I've learned doing this for a very long time is I actually don't start with the questions, I start with the deadline. Sometimes there will be a lot of variability in the timelines for comments. My preference is that we have 60 to 90 days to comment. That fits FASEB's governance structure very well, but depending on the urgency of a topic or an urgency of the group, you might see comment periods as short as 30 days, if not shorter. So sometimes you have to look at the deadline to say, can I even meet this? Especially if you have extensive governance process. The second is to follow the instructions for submission. I know this probably seems like a silly thing to write, but so many times I have seen people submit comments or prepare comments, and then they're not able to fully meet the RFI form just because they didn't realize there was a word limitation. So we are seeing more and more RFIs requiring electronic submission that can either be sending it through email or forms. And a lot of these forms, they all have, you've seen one form, you've seen one. They have different parameters. Some of them will have character or word limits. So you really need to look at the instructions for submission before taking the deep dive and developing your comments. You need to adhere to word limits, especially in these forms. The form will stop accepting information once you hit the character or word limit. And just a reminder that comments to federal agencies are frequently made public and are subject to the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. So you aren't going to want to submit that business plan for that great idea that you have, that great invention that hasn't yet been invented. If you are submitting comments to regulations.gov, I mentioned at the beginning that that's like the electronic file folder. You post one day and your comments are literally available for anyone to read almost immediately or within a few hours. In fact, I posted comments to regulations.gov yesterday and they are already available. So don't assume that your comments will never see the light of day after you click send. And full comments and excerpts of comments may be included in the final reports. So I'll move into a couple of examples. The first one is the NIH postdoc RFI. That's my short name for it, but this is the RFI from NIH, that ACD working group re-envisioning the US postdoctoral research training and career progression within the biomedical research enterprise. That's why I call it the NIH postdoc RFI. So using the information I just shared with you, I start right at the top of the guide notice with those dates. NIH did us a solid with 60-day comment period. And then you go, there's the questions in the middle. I did excerpts, but how to submit a response. Okay, these comments have to be submitted through an electronic submission website. Here's that reminder that you don't want to submit personally identifiable information or anything that you don't want to be made public. So, just that reminder that nothing is confidential when you send it to the government. And here is the actual web form that is cited in that NIH guide notice. This is half of the page. You see that they reiterate the purpose of the RFI, give you the background, and then the questions. So they start with, so there are some questions that are required. So are you representing an individual or an organization, the professional role? These all have to be checked for the form to be activated. And then when you get to the meat of the questions of the form, there are text boxes available. And I went too far on my clicking, but there's a box for each question. And it is important to test the forms because you can see when I took the screenshot, I had actually activated this top rectangle, this top text box, and you can see 0 typed of 300 words allowed. So you always want to be cognizant of the word limits. Sometimes the forms have character limits. And the tip to prepare for that is to do all your deliberations in a separate document before you go into the form and do a copy paste to make sure that you're going to meet the parameters. You don't want to have this fantastic idea and then all of a sudden hit the form and realize you don't have enough room. Second example that I'm going to share is another one that is a hot topic in our community, and that's the NIH Public Access Policy RFI. And so the full name of this is the NIH Plan to Enhance Public Access to the Results of NIH-Supported Research. This is NIH's plan to fulfill the OSTP memo issued in August of last year. And again, looking at the NIH guide notice, you have the key dates. Again, they did us a nice solid with the time period that's available, issuing the RFI in February with comments due in late April. Again, we have another form. And then I highlighted this language here that the responses to the RFI are voluntary. No one is forced to respond to an RFI, but they give you the option of submitting your comments anonymously, or you may claim your comments. For an organization like FASEB, we much prefer to claim our comments. We will claim them even if your website doesn't show them to be claimed. We will post our final comments on our website. But sometimes you might want to submit your comments anonymously. So that postdoc RFI is purposely anonymous. They want everyone to feel free in their comments, and they want to give the same flexibility to this RFI. But if you want to claim your comments and have that follow-up dialogue, it's really important to include your contact information. So here's a screenshot of that public access RFI. And again, you have some of the forms. You don't have any mandatory questions that you have to answer. But the one thing I wanted to flag for this one, I already did the test of the form. There are no character limits, no word limits, so that's all great. But you also have the option to upload files directly. I really love this when we have this opportunity to upload our comments on our letterhead, but you don't always get it. So anytime that you want to, what I will do is I will upload the formal comments as an attachment, but I will also copy and paste the segments responding to specific questions into the form, because I know why they have the form. I have been the recipient of these calls for comments. The form allows for a lot quicker analysis and parsing of the responses received. So even if you have the option to just upload your comments, it's always really important to put the relevant information in the text boxes if those two options are available. And don't forget, you are providing a ton of information to the agencies, but this is a privilege. So you want to always be thankful to the agency for the opportunity to provide input. They don't always have to engage in this. And depending on the stage of where they are in developing a policy, they may choose to do the stakeholder engagement late in the process, but particularly when they are engaging you early in the process before they've made recommendations, it is really a privilege to provide the feedback to the agencies. And just a reminder that your comments could lead to future dialogue on related topics. So, with that, those were my formal comments. My slides will be made available shortly after this webinar, but there's my contact information, and I will go ahead and stop the share. But I thank you all for letting me share this experience that I've gleaned over the past few years.
Thank you so much, Yvette. That was fantastic. Personally, as a trained scientist myself, I think your comparisons to the scientific process and your explanations were so thorough, and it made the entire RFI submission process much less intimidating for me and more accessible. So I'd like to start things off with a couple of questions that came to mind as you spoke. And I'll remind the audience to please post any questions you may have in the chat or Q&A box. So I think first of all, I just want to start off, do you have any examples of recent NIH RFIs and how they have influenced any funding priorities or research directions or policy changes? So, I know we talked a lot about the current ones, like the postdoc that are being accepted right now, but just, I think a lot of people would love perspective on how these have been put into practice.
Oh gosh, there's so many examples, and as you were asking me the question, I was just like, but so
That's great.
one that we'll likely see coming through, and it's at that latter stage, like they just closed the comment period, is the peer review process at NIH. So they presented a streamlined framework for peer review, and not only was it meant to reduce administrative burden, but it was also intended to reduce implicit bias in the review process. So that we just provided comments, but you can think about the data management and sharing policy. I'll pivot to one of my main policy areas that I work on. That process, there were every year, starting in 2018, there was, what should we collect for data management sharing plans? That was 2018. 2019 was the draft plan. What do you think? And so I can go through, and then the final policy was issued in 2020. I can see the aspects of FASEB's feedback. So the supplementary information, one of the things we said is, hey, this is great. Researchers want to share their data, but to process the data so that it's shareable, how do we pay for that? And when you go to the final policy, you see the supplementary documentation because that was a common question. So if you go through the history of that data management sharing policy, you can see a lot of the updates and tweaks. It wasn't like we issued this, we heard you, we ignored you, we moved on. You can see the progression up to the final policy.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I think that's just a great perspective for all of us to have, to know that, when you put all this work into crafting your RFI, following these great tips, it can actually turn into something tangible, because I think that follow through is sometimes hard for, when you're on the other side of things to gain perspective.
And another one is like NCI staff scientist positions. They led the pack in terms of setting up staff scientists. They heard the workforce issue, and so you can see there's so many examples across NIH,
right.
And a lot of times they will cite the public feedback that they received.
Yeah, that's great, and I think that's so exciting, just to see that tangible change happening. So I have another quick question, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
So I was hoping that you could expand on your points, which were really helpful, about representing yourself versus your organization. And I think it was great to hear that these comments can be made public. But so I think for a lot of researchers, including PhD students, postdocs, have concerns about submitting personal views to RFIs. And I just didn't know if you could expand a little bit more, how should researchers approach RFI submissions with their personal thoughts if they're afraid that those may conflict with the thoughts of their PI institution or something like that?
That's a great question. They purposely made the form for the postdoc RFI anonymous, which for an organization that likes to take credit, that's infuriating. But I think it does open the door for individuals to be honest and provide their feedback. There are ways to submit it. Even if it's like regulations.gov, you can say, I'm submitting this anonymously, but you have to be careful to not disclose any of that identifying information, which is I'm a postdoc at XYZ institution. But there are, so I always look at if there's that anonymization button. But if that's your experience, then, I think it's also important to figure out a way that you can infuse that experience into that feedback so that there is a true understanding of the problem. If we are constantly sugarcoating the feedback that is received, and that's why, we will take pretty much any shot that is appropriate for FASEB to take to provide feedback, even if it's like, yeah, this is great. Thank you for doing this, because the agencies sometimes they don't know if the community hears about it. And so that's where FASEB, organizations like Research America, amplifying the opportunities to comment, it might not be appropriate at that time to submit individual comments, but you could do a postdoc association, and then it's not just your N of one perspective, but you will have to have a little bit of a process. But I think it's looking at the forms, figuring out what your feedback is are you going to be able to offer solutions to the issue versus if your comment is a rant about your experience, that's probably not helpful to anyone. So I think it's a tough question, but I think do you think that the agency can learn from your experience? If the answer is yes, then I recommend you find a way to share that feedback in a way that you feel comfortable.
Right. I think that is so helpful. And I think framing it all, remembering to frame everything constructively, and really great information on how to manage, your and being anonymous and your own personal views versus that of your institution. So I think I'm going to go ahead and ask my colleague Jacqueline to come on screen and field any questions from the audience. So if you have any more, feel free to post them.
Thank you, Samantha. And thanks, Yvette, for this presentation. Very informative. So first question from the audience. With a form like the NIH postdoc RFI, where they're asking for responses to very specific questions and a relatively short word count, where do you let them know you're interested in more engagement, thank them for their time, etc.?
That's a great question. And that RFI is a little bit of an anomaly, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just where they are in their process. If you think back to that policy development wheel, they are very much in that information collection stage. And so that RFI really is not well suited for doing the follow-up, but where the follow-up likely will happen is after the next meeting of the NIH Advisory Committee to the director, where they will have collated all the feedback. Sometimes it isn't even an RFI. A strategy that we use at FASEB is we will see the draft report or draft recommendations, and then you have an email. You can go directly to the working group and provide your feedback. I don't recommend it on this RFI because this is their information collection vehicle. I know a couple weeks ago they said they indicated they had at least 2,000 responses. So they're going to have to go through all of that, but there will be that follow-up. This is not going to be the last time that community engages. So you might have to get creative once you see the recommendations come through.
Great, thank you very much. Next question. Is it more worthwhile to submit several individual comments or a comment co-signed by a coalition? Basically, is there a benefit in quantity over quality?
That's a great question. And I didn't touch on this with the regulatory process. A lot of times you will get that email, post your comments to this regulation, and they give you the form. And it is not quantity. because actually they will filter out those duplicate responses, even if they come from a different person. They will score that comment as being from one. You know, just because you had X number of comments saying to do this, and if it's a form, they will still count it as one. Usually that was the advice I was given when I would process comments. So, you know, but if your individual comments are truly individualized and you're bringing something unique to the table, then submit the individual comments. But if you are just literally taking that template and going forward, it's probably better for you to sign on to a coalition letter. So for example, when we do a letter on behalf of FASEB, some of our organizations will say, great, we already commented. A few of our organizations will take those comments and then make them their own and say, in addition to what FASEB said, our particular membership was interested in highlighting this. So, you know, you are always thinking about that quality of the comment.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, next question. How can a postdoc transition from the bench researcher to a science policymaker?
Oh my goodness, so many ways. That's a whole nother talk. But you know, I mean, being here and asking that question is step one, is just showing interest. There are lots of ways that you can get involved in policy while you're still at the bench. One is being part of a science policy discussion group, finding people who are also interested in engaging in those sort of discussions. We have, you know, like I got my start participating in Capitol Hill Days, representing my organization at that time, and I loved it. I had a fellowship. There's a Christine Rosian Science and Technology Policy Fellowship at the National Academies, of which I'm alum. There's also the AAAS fellowship. We also have, and I know Research America has fellowships too. So those are actually great in situ experiments that you can do. Yeah, proof that I was a scientist at one time. But you know, like, I think it's just showing that interest. The other thing that you can do very easily is do informational interviews. My information was pasted up on the end of this presentation. I do probably about 4 to 6 informational interviews a month with people who are thinking they're interested in policy and trying to figure out that next step. Always happy to chat with people. Look for people who have a career path that interests you, and see if it matches your personality. There are so many, just like disciplines of science, there are so many different ways to engage in policy. My career path is just one career path, and I like listening to what your strengths are to figure out where you might want to go next. But lots of ways to get involved. Step one is to admit that you want to.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. Do you recommend following up after submitting a response to an RFI? And if so, what would that follow-up look like?
That's a great question. So it depends on, sometimes you'll see the immediate follow-up. So sometimes an RFI is just the agency taking the temperature, and you get your answer if you see them doing something in that space or if they never touch it again. And you know, so, there are a couple instances that, and one's several years old at this point. Sometimes they'll put the RFI out there, and the feedback is just so like, don't do this. This is a bad idea. You'll never see it again. Depending on your relationship with the agency head, you can always follow up and be like, hey, what happened there? But chances are, if it went into hiding after the comment period, you know that it was like, wow, the community did not like that. A lot of times the agencies will inform us that they received our RFI or our response to an RFI, and they let us know how they address it or how important it is. That's actually my favorite, is where we get the feedback. It's like, thank you for those comments. You know, we really appreciate FASEB's input on this. It was really helpful as we finalize. But the other way to address it is when you see the final recommendations, is you say, send a thank you note. Wow, we saw your final recommendations. We really appreciate you taking FASEB's comments and incorporating them. This is really exciting. Let us know how we can assist in amplifying. So you kind of have to read the room to figure out what the situation is. If you are fortunate enough to have off the record conversations with an agency lead, you can do a little more prying. But, in terms of reaching out to them over email, sometimes they're going to be a little more cautious with that because their email is FOIA-able.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think we only have time for one last question. It's great that the RFI process is available to submit feedback to these agencies, but sometimes there are barriers to submission. Is there a mechanism to submit feedback on the RFI process itself?
Yes. Yes, there has been a lot of activity on stakeholder engagement. And if you go back to my presentation where I talked about, version 1.0 communicating with the stakeholders version versus version 2.0, we're seeing a lot of that shift of mindset of just because there are some processes that are part of law, and then there are other things where there's flexibility. We have certainly at FASEB commented on the RFI process several times, mainly the timeline for submitting comments, and if there is an email at the bottom of an RFI, and you found aspects of the RFI form to be challenging, I will be fully transparent in that postdoc RFI, I was deeply concerned that the words were limited to 300 for each of those responses. These are big sweeping areas of the postdoc experience that have not been resolved over decades. So, how do you parse that down to 300 words? Sometimes once the form is built, you have to work, you have to work in the structure that you're given. But if your feedback is lodged, and I would like to think that the feedback that we gave on the structure of the postdoc RFI informed that public access policy RFI, where you had the little button to submit, you didn't have a word limit on some of the comment boxes. So yes, there always is that opportunity. One of the things is if a comment period is placed just on a blog, FASEB will never be able to comment on that because it'll come from me, and I'm not allowed to speak on behalf of the organization. We have highlighted some of the challenges for organizations through that RFI process.
That's great. And I know we said that was the last question, but I have one more that came from the Q&A box that I thought was really important to ask. And that is, do you have any recommendations or tips that international scholars specifically should keep in mind when submitting their RFI?
I think if you feel comfortable submitting, acknowledging that you're an international scholar, I mean, that international, and I'm going to guess that part of that is tied to the postdoc RFI specifically, but since NIH funds research not only in the US, but is funding international scholars or funding research in other countries, I think it is really important to know where you sit if you are comfortable sharing that information. You should be able to have comments submitted that you should not fear repercussions for submitting your feedback. And I'm sure that's a concern that people are thinking about. Am I going to be restricted in access to funds to do my research, or will I be put on the naughty list? But the international scholar experience is something that needs a lot better understanding. So, I think that there's the opportunity to highlight that you are an international scholar and that's your perspective, just like that. Who are you? You can say, I'm an international scholar. I've been working at this lab, XYZ, for X number of years, and these are my comments.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we are definitely glad we got that last one in since it's so important. But it looks like that is all we have time for today. And I think this has been a terrific discussion. So thanks again, Yvette. And thanks to the audience for your thoughts and your participation in asking questions. I'll turn it back over to Jacqueline to talk about our next upcoming Alliance discussion.
Thank you, Savannah, and thanks, Yvette, again. Thanks to our audience members for tuning in. We'll post these slides to our website under events, then Alliance discussion. A quick announcement before you all go. If you are a Research America member, I hope you will join us next week on Tuesday, March 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Joining us is veteran health policy expert Nick Bath to discuss the controversy surrounding the regulatory review and coverage of new Alzheimer's treatments, as well as the potential implications for medical progress and access to its benefits going forward. If you're a Research America member, look out for the registration link in your inboxes. Thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon, and have a great rest of your day.